What if the woman who spent years branding herself as the face of radical honesty had been quietly hiding a secret about her own identity? So significant that once exposed, it threatened to unravel the entire image she carefully built around herself. This story centers on who Meghan Markle really is, how old she truly may be, and why that number appears to change depending on which archived record you examine. Once you start pulling on that one loose thread, the rest of the narrative begins shifting in ways that are difficult to ignore. The trail stretches from glossy 90s magazines, spreads all the way into Hollywood databases, and the implications strike directly at the core of a global brand founded on the idea of authenticity. To understand why this story is gaining so much traction right now, you first have to understand the atmosphere of suspicion that has gradually formed around the Sussex narrative. In the beginning, public sentiment was filled with genuine support. Harry and Meghan were portrayed as a couple stepping away from royal life in pursuit of openness and transparency. But over time, for a large section of the audience, that goodwill transformed into something far more skeptical. Through the Netflix specials, explosive interviews, and constant media appearances, many people began noticing a pattern where what was presented as authentic self-expression often came across more like a tightly managed public relations campaign. And into that growing skepticism stepped investigators like Candace Owens, asking questions that cut directly into the foundation of Meghan's past. But the story surrounding Meghan's age didn't begin with some massive conspiracy theory. It started with tiny details that seemed insignificant at first, until they refused to stay buried once exposed. Nearly every official biography and thousands of published articles repeat the same date, August 4th, 1981, making her 44 years old today. But when researchers compared that timeline against her schooling, her early career moves, and the people she associated with, the pieces reportedly stopped lining up. According to those digging deeper, the inconsistencies don't merely fail to fit together. They actively collide. Any single discrepancy might be brushed off on its own, but taken collectively, they create a pattern that raises questions the Duchess has rarely had to confront publicly. One of the earliest and most significant red flags involves a 1997 edition of 17 magazine. This wasn't some obscure local publication. It was a major national magazine with huge circulation. In that issue, on page 90, Meghan Markle's age is reportedly listed as 21. If the official 1981 birth year were accurate, she would have been around 15 or 16 at the time. That leaves a discrepancy of roughly 5 or 6 years printed permanently in a mainstream publication. Supporters argue that magazines frequently contain mistakes during the pre-internet era when fact-checking standards were different. But publications generally don't invent dages out of nowhere. Those details typically come from press materials, agencies, or personal biographies supplied by the individual. And if Meghan truly was a teenager at the time, it raises the question of why she was being introduced publicly as a 21-year-old woman. That question leads directly into the brutal realities of lower-tier Hollywood, where age is far more than a number. It can determine your survival. In the entertainment industry, age can either become an advantage or a career obstacle. Before becoming a duchess, Meghan was simply another actress attempting to establish herself inside an unforgiving system. Industry observers have also pointed toward earlier versions of acting databases like IMDb, which allegedly listed her birth year as 1977. Bauer's broader argument paints a picture of the Meghan presented to the world, not as a spontaneous or authentic personality, but as a carefully engineered identity, once shaped by someone who understood the mechanics of influence, networking, and social positioning extremely well. And according to critics, she didn't build that image alone. Much of that transformation allegedly took place inside the elite circles connected to the Soho House network. This is where the story begins taking on an even more mysterious. For years, Meghan has been linked to influential figures associated with Soho House, The global private members club frequented by celebrities, executives, and powerful insiders. Critics argue the network wasn't simply a social venue, but effectively a training ground for image construction, where she learned how high-level networking worked and aligned herself with individuals capable of elevating and reshaping her public profile. Some investigative reporters now believe those same connections may have helped smooth over or sanitize parts of her past before she officially entered royal life. Because when you can influence who speaks and what information reaches the public, you can also shape timeline self. The Soho House narrative presents a version of Meghan far removed from the inexperienced outsider she portrayed herself as during the early stages of her relationship with Harry. And many believe the carefully maintained persona began visibly cracking during the controversial 2026 Australia tour. What was intended to look like a triumphant return to the place where the couple enjoyed enormous popularity back in 2018 instead came across to critics as something closer to a corporate publicity tour. Unlike their original royal visit, which had the backing of the Queen and was met with widespread public enthusiasm, this newer trip operated more like a privately funded pseudo-royal campaign that left many Australians feeling manipulated. Although the Sussexes framed the tour around charity work and public engagement, much of the schedule reportedly revolved around expensive commercial appearances. Meghan headlined her best lifer retreat in Sydney, where ticket prices climbed as high as $3,200. Her appearance on MasterChef Australia also reportedly drew criticism from palace insiders, some of whom described it as outrageous behavior for someone still carrying a royal title. Polling conducted during the visit showed that roughly 75% of Australians felt the tour failed to present her in a positive light. The contradiction became difficult for many observers to ignore. Public figure branding herself as relatable and connected to ordinary people, while simultaneously charging thousands for brief appearances. That increasing commercialization circles directly back to the digital footprint surrounding her public life. After Archie Harrison's birth in 2019, a photo released to the public reportedly contained embedded metadata showing a digital timestamp that differed from the publicly stated timeline by nearly 48 hours. In the world of professional PR management, 2 days can be a massive discrepancy. Of course, technical issues like time zones or device settings can sometimes affect metadata, but when every aspect of someone's public narrative is already being intensely examined, even a minor inconsistency quickly becomes part of a much larger and more unsettling pattern. Critics argue it contributes to the impression of a life being carefully produced instead of naturally lived, and that ultimately becomes the real distinction. The difference between openly sharing your life with the public and meticulously staging it for a global audience. But none of those questions matter more than what all of this means for the man standing beside her through every chapter of the story. Prince Harry has spent much of the last 6 years insisting that the royal family is a cold and toxic institution, giving up military roles, straining family relationships, and sacrificing much of his standing in Britain in order to defend his wife and her version of events. He positioned himself as the ultimate protector, the man determined not to let history repeat itself the way it had with his mother. But sitting at the center of that entire mission is one deeply unsettling question. What happens if Harry eventually realizes that the story he gave up everything to protect may itself be built on carefully managed inconsistencies? Every major decision he has made has rested on the assumption that Meghan's account of her past and her experiences is completely accurate. And if portions of that story turn out to be less than entirely truthful, the consequences for Harry go far beyond embarrassment. The reputational damage would cut deeply because he isn't simply supporting the narrative. He has become the central figure defending it. In many ways, he is the primary investor in a public story that is now facing increasing scrutiny from every direction. And then there are Archie and Lilibet, children growing up inside a household where their family identity has become tied to an ongoing public debate over honesty and authenticity. One day, when they are old enough to search through their own family history online, they won't just encounter polished fairy tale headlines. They'll also discover the metadata discrepancies, the conflicting magazine reports, and the investigative breakdowns dissecting their mother's timeline piece by piece. Now, Candace Owens has spoken directly about this, arguing that the long-term impact of these controversies may ultimately fall hardest not on Harry or Meghan, but on the children forced to inherit a legacy clouded by public doubt. And that's an enormous burden to hand to the next generation. While the Sussexes have continued producing documentaries, interviews, and public statements aimed at defending their narrative, the royal family has responded in a dramatically different way. The contrast becomes especially obvious when comparing Harry and Meghan to William and Catherine. During some of the most difficult periods of their own lives, including Catherine's health crisis, they maintained a level of composure and restraint that resonated deeply with the British public. There were no emotional tell-all specials or carefully staged media campaigns. And instead, they carried on quietly with their duties. That silence, for many observers, projected dignity. And in comparison, the Sussex approach has increasingly started to feel performative. The palace hasn't needed to publicly address the age controversy or any of the conflicting reports because, in the eyes of many, the difference in behavior already speaks volumes. Even people closest to Meghan seem to add further layers of uncertainty to the story. Thomas Markle has shared endless stories over the years about her childhood, her ambition, and her determination to succeed. Yet whenever questions surrounding her exact birth year emerge, his answers reportedly become strangely cautious, often redirecting people toward official records, instead of responding with the instant confidence most would expect from a father. Then there's Samantha Markle, who has openly claimed that the age gap between herself and Meghan never felt anywhere close to the officially stated 17 years. According to Samantha, their relationship felt more consistent with a difference of around 10 or 12 years, rather than nearly 2 decades. Now, Samantha certainly carries her own baggage as one of Meghan's most outspoken critics. But what keeps drawing attention is the fact that her claims happen to align closely with the 1977 birth year theory. And when even siblings appear uncertain about the official timeline, critics argue it naturally raises the question of why the public should accept it without skepticism. But if you step back from the specific allegations for a moment, the magazine articles, the database entries, the university inconsistencies, what remains underneath is a much larger story about how public identities are in the modern era. Today, personal narrative has become one of the most valuable forms of currency for anyone seeking global influence. Every successful celebrity or influencer brand revolves around a compelling story of hardship, resilience, and transformation. Meghan's old lifestyle blog, The Tig, was essentially an early blueprint for that strategy. A polished, curated glimpse into the exact version of herself she wanted the public to embrace. The problem with building your image around radical transparency, however, is that the entire structure depends on people believing the authenticity at the center of. Once audiences begin noticing adjustments to smaller details, whether it's your age, your background, or your academic history, they naturally begin wondering what else may have been selectively managed. And for many people who spent years defending the Sussexes and extending endless benefit of the doubt, patience for those inconsistencies appears to be fading rapidly. The transformation from struggling actress to duchess is undeniably an extraordinary story, but only if events unfolded the way they were originally presented. If major parts of that history were strategically revised along the way, then the narrative changes entirely. What once looked like a story of perseverance begins to resemble something much more calculated. In Hollywood, appearing younger has long been treated as a survival tactic. In royal life, however, honesty is expected. And when those two worlds collided, the very image management techniques that may have helped Meghan rise in Hollywood now appear to critics to have become a serious liability. Most audiences didn't suddenly turn against the Sussexes because of one dramatic headline. It happened gradually through hundreds of smaller moments where things simply didn't feel fully genuine. And the continuing focus on Soho House only strengthens that perception. Critics have argued for years that Meghan's involvement in those elite networking circles points to someone far more socially strategic and ambitious than the inexperienced outsider image she portrayed when she first entered Harry's world. Old interviews and archived blog posts eventually resurfaced, showing Meghan commenting on Catherine's wedding years earlier, despite later claiming she knew very little about the royal family. Those details weren't brushed aside as harmless memories from the past. Critics viewed them as evidence of a carefully managed public persona. And when the questions surrounding her age are added into that larger pattern, the result is a portrait of someone who appears to have approached the construction of her image with remarkable precision and intent. The financial stakes connected to all of this are enormous. Companies like Netflix and Spotify invested tens of millions of dollars into the Meghan Markle brand, and the value of that brand depends heavily on public belief in her authenticity. The Spotify partnership has already collapsed, with executives openly expressing frustration afterward. And if audiences begin concluding that the deeply personal truths driving the Sussex narrative aren't entirely reliable, corporate support can disappear just as quickly, just as quickly as public goodwill. After all, selling authenticity becomes impossible once people stop believing they're hearing the truth in the first place. And this latest investigation into Meghan's age isn't an isolated controversy. It's part of a much broader reassessment of where the Sussexes now stand globally. Their relationship with the monarchy remains frozen in a kind of permanent deadlock, with no obvious route toward reconciliation. At the same time, their media strategy appears to be reaching a point where each new project generates less. The monarchy survives because it ultimately exists beyond any one individual story. The Sussexes, however, have built almost everything around their story. And when that story begins losing credibility under the weight of repeated inconsistencies, it creates not only a reputational problem, but a financial one as well. Their lifestyle, influence, and commercial appeal are all tied directly to the public value of their personal narrative. Every crack in that narrative, therefore, carries consequences far beyond simple public criticism. And it raises a larger, more uncomfortable question. What kind of person treats the foundational facts of their own life as material to shape into a more compelling narrative? More importantly, where does that shaping stop? Candace Owens has argued that this kind of flexibility doesn't remain limited to one small detail. According to her, if someone is willing to adjust something as basic as a birth year for strategic reasons, it naturally creates concern about what else may also have been selectively reframed. That's ultimately why so many people feel uneasy about the entire situation, because at its core, this story isn't really about a number at all. It's about trust. And once trust begins eroding publicly, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult. For years, these discussions existed mostly in smaller online spaces, dismissed as conspiracy theories or internet trolling. But once larger public figures and media personalities started bringing the records and inconsistencies into mainstream conversation, simple dismissal no longer worked as effectively. The 1997 17 magazine listing placing her age at 21. The metadata inconsistencies are real. The changing database entries are real. Yet critics point out that the response has largely consisted of more tightly controlled PR messaging and further claims of victimization, neither of which actually resolves the underlying questions. Looking ahead through the rest of 2026, the contrast between the Sussexes and the monarchy is likely to become even more pronounced. While the King and the Prince of Wales continue carrying out traditional royal duties with institutional stability behind them, the Sussexes remain dependent on whatever their next media venture delivers. And people are watching closely, not necessarily because they enjoy the controversy, but because they are searching for something that feels genuine. The 17 magazine discrepancy, the IMDb changes, the alumni records. Critics argue these are only the opening pieces of a much larger puzzle. And once pressure begins exposing cracks in a carefully maintained structure, eventually the entire foundation gets tested. Whether Meghan Markle will ever provide a fully verifiable explanation that satisfies these questions remains uncertain. But until that happens, the suspicion surrounding the story is unlikely to disappear. And that's where things stand now. Not at a final conclusion, but at a growing collection of unanswered questions that continue demanding clarity. Truth isn't something that can always be managed, scheduled, or strategically packaged. Sooner or later, it tends to surface on its own terms, especially when reputations on a global scale are involved. Right now, much of the public is still waiting for the one piece of information that makes all the other inconsistencies finally make sense together. Until then, critics argue the performance itself continues losing credibility with the very audience it most needs to persuade. Many of you watching have spent years extending patience and benefit of the doubt to the Sussexes. But eventually, a long pattern of supposed innocent mistakes stops feeling accidental. And in this entire saga, trust may be the one thing currently in shortest supply. Thank you for spending this time here today. If this discussion gave you something to think about, dropping a like helps more people discover it. And if you haven't subscribed already, make sure to hit that button so you don't miss the next chapter. Share this video if you believe these conversations deserve a wider audience because they're discussions worth having openly. Until next time, take care of yourselves.